Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Well, looks like it's that time again. What? You didn't sleep yet? Well, I suppose I can understand why. You never know what's lurking in your dreams. Well, until now, that is. So, prop those eyelids open and prepare to fight back the fear. It's time we get back to the land of nightmares with Dreamscape Ouroboros, Part 2, The Obsidian City.
Smoky clouds of various colors swirled about me in a torrent of disorientation. Every color within our spectrum, and some not, never seen by me before. Colors that danced between the boundaries of warm and cold, indicating energy spectrums, wavelengths, and other myriads of descriptions that failed to do their concept justice, and were otherwise indescribable. Within these smoky colors, I saw spherical bubbles about half the size of myself passing by me, floating through this discorporated dreamlike realm. I saw shapes and colors within the bubbles, all bright colors such as red, green, and blue, and within these hueful mists were events that played out, contained within their spherical container, without any heed to anything occurring outside of them. All happy and dreamlike events, like playing with children, flying kites, and the like. And as I watched them further, disembodied in my own right, I began to notice creatures that seemed to form within the mist around me, as if made up of the mist itself, only smoky and black, existing only to attach themselves to some of these bubbles. These tentacled and clawed amorphous beings attached themselves to bubbles in a manner that seemed like feeding from or draining them of something unseen, taken from their bubble host. As they did, the shifting reds, blues, and greens turned into that of grays, mucky browns, and black. This seemed to have a direct effect on the scenes contained within the bubbles, changing their themes from happy influences to those of dread and fear. Scenes of people drowning, burning, sobbing over graves. As the horror of all that I witnessed bore down on me like a wet blanket of dread, I saw a lone bubble floating in the opposite direction as the others. This had a shadow creature attached, but instead of feeding upon it, it seemed as though it was leading it, taking it far away from the others. Within the sphere, I saw a familiar face, one that belonged to me. An expression of wonder and fear all at once, at something I could not see. Then it all ended as abruptly as it had begun. I opened my eyes. Once I did, my focus immediately targeted my surroundings, and for a moment I forgot all that I had just described, what I would realize to be a dream. I stared hard into the black. I could not initially define anything other than total and utter blackness. As my eyes fully adjusted to the all but consuming darkness, I realized that the resolute stoniness and rigid texture of the walls, floor, and otherwise ceiling mimicked that of the unyielding and lumpy character of my own scalp, where I must have knocked it on a nearby rock due to my fall into that dark abyss beneath that old house. After meeting with the man known as the cultist and Dr. Phillips, I was encouraged into venturing out to the site of a brutal murder committed by the former and given to the care of the latter. One man insisted that I visited this deplorable location to gain insight into his own version of events, while the other told me that I should do the same, only for different reasons. Dr. Phillips's reasoning being that of shedding light on the contrast between two different versions of events. But if I'm being honest with myself, the only reason that I had resigned to spending my rainy afternoon in the basement of that old house was to investigate the recollections and accounts of the man known as the cultist, as they related to an old book that lay stored within the archives of the Miskatonic University. I'm unsure if I was under the influence of my own aspirations, the terrible nightmares plaguing my every rest, or if it was something more. Nevertheless, the end result was my coming here, the old flesh-bound book in hand, and now, as I sat up rubbing my head, recollecting all that had transpired in getting me here, I remembered that I had dropped that book, and apparently the flashlight as well. I must have scoured on my hands and knees for that old tome for quite a few minutes, maybe an hour, but somehow neither was anywhere to be found, and just as with the lack of an opening above my head, now only solid rock, it made no sense. I was pretty sure that I had not been carried or moved, that both I and the book had fallen into the same place, and yet I seemed to have ended up within a different place entirely. With no other direction in which to proceed, no other options, I ventured forth into the blackness that seemed to have no end. The stagnant and musty air was nearly enough to engage my gag reflex, old moisture, like that of foul mud, so palpable that it was as though I consumed the air rather than breathed it. Eventually, however, my satiety had been overstrained to the point where I no longer smelled or tasted anything at all. Still, it must have taken hours to reach this point, but it was around this time that I first found something curious in the black. I had almost mistaken it for a rock or stone, the overall mass of it black and withered with age. Stopping to inspect the odd shape in the dark, I came to the realization that I was indeed looking at the remains of some form of humanoid creature, but certainly not human. The proportion of the collarbone, the multiple joints in the arms, ending in dual-digit hands that seemed more a mass of calcium, porous with numerous holes resembling the empty eye sockets of some overgrown insect, long since perished. At this moment, I was sure that I was mistaken. The odd shape was positively too obscure to be accurately defined in near total blackness, but I realized that I had to be wrong, and that what lay before me was nothing more than an odd and peculiar formation of rock. Before I could spend another thought on this odd amalgamation of what was surely minerals and sediment, I pondered at the fact that I was surrounded by near total, but not holistic, darkness. There should have been no light down here at all, yet something was allowing me to barely see. The effect was so faint that I walked further away, into the direction that I had now been trekking once more, before I finally realized it, made apparent by several brilliant flecks of glittering light. It was the rocks and the substrates themselves that emanated light, light embedded like sand, emanating from a faint amount of phosphorescence that must have been present in the stone here. The more I progressed onward, the more brilliant and present it became, lending more and more capability for eyesight to render detail of my surroundings. My thoughts had drifted away from the odd rocky protrusion that I had discovered, but the discoveries I would soon make would call it back to the forefront of my mind with recollection and pertinence. Soon, the cramped confines of the subterranean tunnel opened up, inviting my eyes to see all that resided within. If it had not been for the glowing flecks in the stone around me, I may have never even noticed it. The ground on which I carefully walked sloped downward, as it led into a massive, open space. The ceiling stretched high, now nearly 100 feet above my crown, and I remembered thinking, how far below ground had I traversed? The side walls ended at the top of the slope and extended so far back into the great chamber that I could not see where they ended. Obstructing my vision of those far-off, sheer stone walls was a conglomeration of large, square, and rectangular objects that seemed also made of stone, yet not the same that made up the walls, floor, and ceiling. These blocky pieces of substrate, stretching 10 to 40 feet high and maybe 25 to 50 feet wide, were gargantuan in their own right, but did not contain the phosphorescence of their counterparts that surrounded them here. Their hue was that of pitch black, darker and more abysmal in appearance than the walls and ceiling enveloping them. It seemed to almost absorb the faint light that enveloped it here, reflecting none of it, hiding any further detail than what I could discern at a distance. Inspecting the paths as I traveled, I saw that it split into various alleys and through terraces that led between monumental black anomalies, much in the way that streets or roads would. I was surprised as I walked to find myself more correct than not, as it did seem as if many, if not all, of these blocks of solid black boasted an aperture that allowed access to some unseen interior. I ran my hand across the surface of one of these black walls to find it just as smooth as any other that I had ever felt, very similar to that of glass, yet with the rigidity of stone. Still, no matter how close I came to it, its visual attribute held fast. No sheen. No marks or scratches. It was as if the surface was there in front of me, but my mind was unable to process that which it visually imbibed, rendering the image to my mind as a vacant void, as if not visibly present at all. However, that which resided inside, beyond the aperture, made my thoughts jolt in recollection, and adrenaline pulse with trepidation. The door or walkway through which I had entered had been at least 15 feet tall, and if it was indeed a door, the being that may have used it would have to have been of formidable size. And that was the thing. Before me, slumped on the floor like a heap of trash left by the wayside for what must have been an eon at the very least, lay the remnants of a most peculiar creature. What must have been its skeletal frame was all that remained, yet the bones themselves looked petrified, as if made of the dark phosphorescent stone that illuminated this subterranean, abandoned metropolis of sorts. The various bone-like segments even glittered with the same flecks of light as the stones comprising this cavern. What must have been its skull seemed littered with several eye sockets, like that of an insect, indicating that if this thing was ever once a living creature, it surely had several eyes. 2 bipedal, leg-like bone segments exuded from a slender trunk, prominently displaying 6 thick, individual rib-like structures. Legs extended and bent backwards, like an animal's haunch, and the arms, long and thin, extended from what may have been its collarbone, and both extending segments ended in dual, large pointed, long digits that sported bony, toothy, dull protrusions at their interiors, facing each other, much like the claw of a crab. And then I thought back to the mass in the darkness that I had noticed earlier, the rock formation with an insect-like skull at its top. I had been correct the first time. It was the remains of some unknown creature that I had found previously, solidified by the latest discovery that I had just made, assisted by dim illumination. Part of me marveled at the unfathomed implications of such a discovery. An ancient race of what appeared to have been sentient and intelligent beings, indicated by the apparent subterranean civilization that I now found myself within, either buried by eons of forgotten time, or possibly been here all the while, without our knowing so. But why had they all either died off or abandoned this place? Where had they gone, if there were survivors at all? Faintly, in one of the blackened corners of the room, just out of the direct phosphorescent light, the definition of something purposeful became visible to my ever-adapting eyesight. Walking closer to it, squinting my eyes, I saw it to be a shelf. Of course, the shelf was grand, like a bookcase that stood nearly 10 feet tall, with about a foot between each plank. There were a total of 9 shelves, all of which spanning nearly 15 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Most of the shelves were empty, but the top few contained objects that looked similar in size and shape to that of coffee cans. They were large and stout, cylindrical shaped, but utterly metallic. Reaching my hands out to grab one, I discovered 2 things. Firstly, the canisters were very heavy, almost too weighty for the capability of lifting. Second, there were the technological elements presented on them. 3 ports of what looked like to be outlets for some kind of plugs. What purpose these were for, I had no idea, but one thing was for sure: whoever or whatever this race was or had been, terrestrial or not, they certainly seemed more technologically advanced than us. The thoughts associated with these beings and their demise, their prowess with technology, why they were here, and what could have happened to them, all coalesced in my mind, causing it to reel at the monumentality of the information being processed, and whether it was the unknown or the terror of some subconscious truth that I had yet to recognize. My mind recoiled in horror all the same. I left that abode of obsidian stone in a cognitive state of disequilibrium, mentally wrestling with more concepts than I could process, too large to wrap my mind around. It felt as if, for a moment, I was losing my mind. However, the new angle of perception, enabled by my new position of exiting through the aperture, revealed a distant glow, some 200 yards away. Its source hidden from sight by the monolithic black structures obstructing my vision. Apprehension and fear of the unknown swaddled me again like a blanket, but curiosity pushed me onward, and I had all but forgotten about that which I had lost: the Necronomicon. Wandering through dystopian street-like passageways that, if it were not for that unknown distant glow, would have been otherwise aimless. These visual elements and absurd environments were entirely foreign to me, and in all honesty, the sights were equally unnerving as they were spectacularly beautiful. The phosphorescent glow of the surrounding stone of this giant chamber mimicked that of a million stars, shining down upon a black, vacated, city-like landscape, all carved from rock and smooth stone-like materials, buried unknown fathoms beneath the surface of the earth. Again, as I walked, thoughts of grand implications engorged my consciousness, and I remained focused on such until rounding the corner of that last monolithic structure, hiding the source of the glowing red light from view. Once in my line of vision, my mind wandered again from thoughts of hows and whys, planting it firmly upon the sight now before me. It was a great passage, illuminated by a red glow that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within, and as I stepped up to the precipice of that yawning maw, I saw what looked like a tunnel so wide and deep, extending beyond my capacity for sight in the dim red light, that it stretched out before me like the rocky innards of some great leviathan. Now, fueled by intrigue and vague delusions of grandeur, I pushed onward, descending into the bowels of that earthy belly. It occurred to me as I wandered ever forward that crossing these subterranean expanses mentally, recording all that I had, was not all that dissimilar from taking a stroll through time itself. For how long had these monumental walls stood true, watching over a civilization that rose and fell without cessation? What wonders could these earthy fathoms reveal? My mind was such a whirlwind that it took the walls and ceiling opening up once more to tear my focus away and recenter it upon this absurd reality unfolding before my eyes. Another great chamber, much like that which held the city made of obsidian black, only this one containing a single structure, though albeit larger and consuming to look upon with its grand size, and also made of the same pitch-black stone. Steps that led from its pyramidal base to its summit began their interlaid runners only a few hundred yards or so before me, but must have ascended at least twice that distance. Drawn nearer, I realized that similar staircases were likely present on all four sides, accented and inferred by the structure and its design. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that whatever it was that I was looking for, or that maybe what had even led me here, awaited at the top of what can only be described as a grand and monumental temple of sorts, constructed of some black rock-type substrate foreign to all of mankind's accumulated knowledge. Approaching the sight that towered over me, like a god looking down upon those too small and insignificant to sincerely care for, a strong sensation of the minuscule began to grow within me, as if I were but a speck floating upon some great sea of impermeable black depths of unknown expanses, and in that moment I felt as if my life meant truly nothing, that my dreams, my experiences, and all that I held dear was of absolutely no value in the face of whatever deities pull the strings of the universe. Still, as utterly unhinging as the temple-like structure was to me, I was compelled to ascend the steps to its peak. However, nearing the first step of many, I found that it rose nearly my waist at its height, and each subsequent step was identical in dimensions. Either this grand staircase was no staircase at all, just a byproduct of aesthetic design, much like the Great Pyramids of Egypt, or whatever beings were intended to scale its great height were sure to be taller than any known human being in recorded history. Thinking back on the great skeletal beings that I had discovered previously, I believed with my holistic being that the step's intended purpose to be likely the latter of these two assumptions. It took moderate effort to hoist myself upon each riser as I climbed, making the cumulative journey to the top all that more arduous. I initially assumed that as I progressed, the looming horizon of the summit slowly descending, that it would reveal the source of that dim red glow of stony backdrop. But no such knowledge was provided to me, even though I had no idea as to what source that crimson light emanated from. In that same vein, I have little doubt that its existence was the rendered result of machinations in constructs so advanced that I had no hope in understanding them in their entirety. Soon, however, the approaching lip to the summit began to reveal something else, something that resided there, that I was unable to see from its base. Its form was as massive as it was black, nothing more than a great silhouette standing against a dim, red, glowing backdrop. My lungs and muscles burned, begging my mind and body for a respite, but I was so near the top, my curiosity once again pricked. I continued on. Pulling myself onto a grand slab of obsidian black after that last riser, I rolled onto my back and decided only then to rest before I investigated any further. However, once I opened my previously closed and fatigued eyes, my choice of inquiry or arrest was taken from me, for the amorphous mass that I had been so curious of loomed over top of me like some giant, upended squid-like tower that either moved as I examined it, or somehow was more than my mind could process, always shifting and reforming, an attribute I would later discover to be a terrible truth. Climbing to my feet and taking a couple of steps, I was halted where I stood, paralyzed in trepidation that I had never known could exist on such a scale, induced by the sight of a great eye opening to glare down upon me, indicating knowledge of my presence. It was at that thought that rendered me immobile and nearly mad, for the visage was nothing shy of celestial abomination. I fell backwards, returning to my seated position on that rigid black substrate, only this time I was scrambling backwards as fast as I could, much in the way a crab would move. However, I never once broke my gaze with that monster, a cat-like eye set within a black silhouette, and as I watched it open further, the red glow that surrounded me on all sides grew brighter and intensified. As it did, the increased illumination revealed a great many details present on that dark mass, whose skin, like flesh, was nearly as black as the ancient temple on which it stood. Its massive body was more of an amalgamation of nightmarish tentacles and limbs, all exuding from a towering trunk that sat blob-like where it resided, as if the mass contained no skeletal structure at all. Millions upon millions of eyes and mouths riddled each of these elements, and random parts like bedsores. Eyes blinking and twitching, mouths that opened and closed, gnashing at seemingly nothing. Atop this abomination, set deep within what could only be described as a large obsidian face with no nose, gleamed that single, massive, cyclopean eye. Underneath it was one grand maw, lined with thousands of teeth, and it began to open, revealing its presence to me for the first time. The last thing that I remember hearing is that awful sound, a sound so loud and unhinged from our meager perceptions of the world, it nearly drove me insane. I think it was attempting to speak, but when it did, I was instantly washed with a sensation of dizziness and subsequently was sent, mind spinning, to the floor on which I sat, from seated to lying down. The last thing that I recall before being whisked away by fantastical dreams, plethoras of wondrous things, and nightmarish beings too far outside the realm of what can possibly exist in our reality to be real, I finally caught sight of that flesh-bound book, the Necronomicon, sitting beside a writhing black tentacle at the celestial abomination's base. It was far too late for that now. I was lost within a sanity-consuming nightmare-scape.
Well, if you think your bed is safe now, think again. There's one more tale to tell before we wrap this up, minus what's in the book, of course. But if you're tired of waiting for good horror, there's no need. Just stop back in again next weekend as we return to the lake for the second to last time. And as always, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.